July 5th, 2020, 1:37 a.m. 28 Indian sailors are sleeping in their bunks aboard the oil tanker. Empty Gulf sky, anchored off Corfacon, United Arab Emirates. These men have no idea that in exactly 8 minutes, armed gunmen will storm their vessel, tie their hands with cable ties, put guns to their heads, and force them to sail into Iranian waters. But here is the part that should terrify you. The world would call this a hijacking. The United States would claim the crew did it voluntarily. Iran would say they were rescuing the vessel and the 28 men who lived through it. They'd spend weeks trying to convince anyone who would listen that they were kidnapped at gunpoint by what they believe were Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces. So let me ask you something right now. Before we go any further, if armed men boarded your ship in the middle of the night, tied you up, blindfolded you, and forced you to sail to a foreign country, would you call that a hijacking? Or would you believe the governments when they said you went there voluntarily? Keep that question in your mind, because what I'm about to show you is one of the most bizarre maritime incidents in modern history. A story where the truth is tangled in conflicting accounts, where 3 governments are playing geopolitical chess with human lives, and where 28 ordinary sailors got caught in the crossfire of international sanctions, oil smuggling, and Middle Eastern power struggles. The crew said they were held at gunpoint, had their hands tied by armed robbers using cable ties, and were later blindfolded when disembarking the vessel. But that's just the beginning. By the time this nightmare ends, 26 crew members will finally make it home to India after weeks of detention in Iran. 2 men will remain trapped in Iran for a little longer, caught in bureaucratic limbo. And the truth about what really happened that night, it'll be clouded by diplomatic silence, conflicting reports, and the world's short attention span. This is the story they don't want you to know. This is the Mount Gulf Sky hijacking, and I promise you nothing is what it seems. Let me take you back to May 2020. The Mount Gulf Sky, a massive 264-meter oil tanker weighing 78,000 tons, is sitting at anchor off Corfacon in the United Arab Emirates. Now, if you don't work in maritime shipping, you might not know what at anchor means in this context. It doesn't mean the ship is just casually parked there for a few hours. This tanker had been sitting in that same spot for months since at least March 2020. Just floating there, waiting. Pop quiz. Why would an oil tanker worth millions of dollars just sit at anchor for months, burning money on crew salaries and port fees, doing absolutely nothing? I'll give you 3 options. Mechanical problems. The owner ran out of money. Something illegal is going on if you guess number 3. Congratulations, sir. Starting to understand how this industry actually works. The United States government had been tracking the Mount Gulf Sky because they believed it was being used to circumvent sanctions on Iran. See, when America puts sanctions on a country like Iran, it means companies aren't supposed to do business with them, including buying or selling Iranian oil. But oil is money. Huge money. And when there's money to be made, people find ways around the rules. The allegation was this. The Mount Gulf Sky was part of a scheme to secretly transport Iranian oil, disguising its origin and selling it on the black market. If true, this would be a massive violation of international sanctions. We're talking millions of dollars in illegal transactions. But here's where it gets interesting. The ship was flagged in Dominica, tiny Caribbean nation that, let's be honest, registers ships for money and doesn't ask too many questions. The crew was all Indian nationals, the actual ownership of the vessel. That's buried under about 17 layers of shell companies, none of which want their names publicly associated with this mess. So you've got a ship with unclear ownership, possibly smuggling Iranian oil, sitting off the coast of the UAE for months, while various governments try to figure out what to do about it. Now, imagine you're one of those 28 crew members. You signed up for what you thought was a routine job on an oil tanker. Decent pay, a few months at sea, then home to your family. Standard maritime work. But instead, you find yourself stuck on a ship that won't move in a foreign anchorage. With no clear answers about when you'll get paid or when you'll go home, you're starting to realize that whatever is happening with this vessel, it's way above your pay grade. These weren't pirates. These weren't criminals. These were regular maritime workers, engineers, deckhands, cooks, navigation officers, guys with families back in India counting on their paychecks, men who had no idea they designed onto a vessel caught in the middle of an international incident. Human Rights at Sea first reported this case on May 27, 2020, as a case of alleged welfare and labor rights abuse of seafarers aboard the vessel. The crew was complaining that they weren't being paid properly, that conditions were deteriorating, that they had no clear idea when they'd be relieved or allowed to go home. The crew started reaching out to maritime welfare organizations, sending messages home to their families, trying to get help. They were essentially trapped, not prisoners. Exactly, but stuck on a vessel that had become radioactive in the shipping world. And then, on July 5th, 2020, everything changed. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want you to think about this. You're on a ship at night. You're in your bunk, maybe reading, maybe sleeping. Suddenly, you hear sounds. Footsteps. Shouting. Unfamiliar voices. What's going through your head? Are you thinking pirates? Are you thinking Coast Guard inspection? Are you confused? Because that's exactly what 28 men experienced at 1:37 a.m. On July 5th, 2020, armed gunmen boarded the Mount Gulf Sky, not slowly, not with warning. They came fast, organized, and heavily armed. And what happened in the next 6 hours would turn this from a maritime labor dispute into one of the most controversial hijackings in modern history. Let me walk you through what the crew later testified happened that night, and I need you to pay very close attention, because the details matter. 1:37 a.m. The first crew member to notice something wrong is on watch. He sees boats approaching the Gulf Sky. Small, fast boats. Multiple vessels. This is unusual. Commercial ships don't typically approach an anchored vessel in the middle of the night without radio contact. This crew member immediately knows something is wrong. He tries to raise the alarm. He grabs the radio, but before he can fully alert the rest of the ship, the armed men are already climbing aboard. The crew indicates they were held at gunpoint, had their hands tied by armed robbers using cable ties, and were later blindfolded when disembarking the vessel. Think about that for a second. Cable ties, the kind of heavy-duty zip ties that police use for mass arrests. These weren't amateurs with rusty AK-47s. This was an organized operation. One crew member later described waking up to find a man with a rifle standing over his bunk, shouting at him in Farsi, a language he didn't understand. He was dragged out of bed. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and he was forced to the floor with the others. Another sailor said he tried to resist, to demand identification, to ask who these men were and what authority they had to board the vessel. He was struck with a rifle butt and told to shut up. These men were terrified. Some of them thought they were going to die. In the world of maritime piracy, crew members getting killed during boardings isn't uncommon. Somali pirates, Southeast Asian pirate gang seize groups don't always leave survivors. From Iran's perspective, this was a ship that had been operating illegally, possibly on behalf of their enemies, and they had every right to detain it. And from the crew's perspective, they were just trying to survive and get home. Here's what I need you to think about. Who do you believe? The crew says they were hijacked. Iran says they came voluntarily. The US says the ship was breaking sanctions. Can all three of these things be true? Can none of them be true? Or is the truth somewhere in the middle, more complicated than anyone wants to admit? Comment below. Who do you think is lying in this situation? 4 months before the hijacking, the 28 Indian seafarers were already in limbo, stuck on a ship that hadn't moved since at least March 2020, unpaid and uncertain. After the July 5th hijacking, their ordeal continued in Iran, with most detained 4 weeks, and 2 held longer due to expired passports. Think about that. Weeks of not knowing if you'll ever see your family again. Weeks of being stuck in a foreign country, possibly being used as bargaining chips in international negotiations you don't understand. Like in India, families were desperate. Wives were calling every government office they could find. Children were asking when daddy was coming home. Elderly parents were wondering if they'd ever see their sons again. The Indian government was trying to negotiate. Maritime welfare organizations were trying to apply pressure, but Iran wasn't budging. And with COVID-19 raging across the world in 2020, international travel and diplomatic negotiations were even more complicated than usual. Investigators from the Dominica Maritime Administration published an official report on July 19th that included testimony from the crew. Lead investigator Eric Davisky wrote explicitly that the crew claimed they were under duress and held at gunpoint. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't rumor. This was official testimony in an international maritime investigation. But here's the problem. Who was going to do anything about it? Dominica is a tiny country with no military and very little diplomatic power. India was trying to negotiate, but had limited leverage over Iran. The UAE, where the hijacking occurred, wasn't particularly interested in starting a conflict with Iran over 28 foreign sailors. And the United States, they were more focused on the sanctions angle than on the welfare of the crew. So the 28 men waited, and waited, and waited. But then, something changed. We still don't know exactly what diplomatic deal was struck, what behind-the-scenes negotiations took place. But on July 14th, 2020, 26 crew members arrived back in India. 26 men finally got to hug their wives, hold their children, sleep in their own beds. But notice I said 26, not 28. 2 crew members, the chief engineer and an able seaman, remained in Iran for several weeks longer, detained due to expired passports until late July 2020. Why were these 2 held back? Were they seen as key witnesses or leverage in negotiations? We still don't have answers to those questions, and that's what makes this story so disturbing. August 2020. The BBC investigates the Gulf Sky hijacking incident. International media is finally starting to pay attention to this bizarre story. And as reporters dig deeper, the contradictions become impossible to ignore. Let us look at the facts we know to be true. Fact 1. The Mount Gulf Sky was anchored off the UAE 4 months before July 5, 2020. Fact 2. On July 5, 2020, the ship suddenly sailed to Iran. Fact 3. The crew testified they were boarded by armed men and forced to sail at gunpoint. Fact 4. The crew was held in Iran 4 weeks against their will. Fact 5. The US government claimed the ship was involved in sanctions violations. Fact 6. Iran claimed the ship came to their waters legally. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because depending on which government you ask, you get completely different interpretations of those same facts. US government position. The Mount Gulf Sky was part of an illegal scheme to transport Iranian oil in violation of sanctions. The crew likely sailed to Iran voluntarily to avoid prosecution. This was not a hijacking, it was sanctions evasion. Iranian government position. The Gulf Sky was operating in our waters legally. The crew requested our assistance. We protected them and eventually facilitated their safe return home. The US is lying about sanctions violations to justify their aggressive policies. Crew position. We were hijacked by armed men at gunpoint. We were forced to sail to Iran. We were held against our will. We are victims of a crime, not participants in sanctions evasion. So, who's telling the truth? Here's what I think after researching this case for months. Everyone's story conflicts, and the full truth is hard to pin down. The crew's detailed testimonies and official reports point to Iranian involvement, but without definitive proof, the incident remains shrouded in diplomatic silence. Was the Mount Gulf Sky involved in sanctions evasion? Probably. Yes. The ship's ownership structure, its months-long anchorage, its mysterious cargo history, all of this points to something shady happening. Was the crew aware of this? Probably not the full extent. Regular crew members don't usually know the details of cargo ownership or financial transactions. They just work the ship. Were the crew hijacked by armed men? Almost certainly yes. Their testimony is too consistent, too detailed, and too corroborated by the timeline to be fabricated. Were those armed men acting on orders from the Iranian government? This is where it gets murky. Iran denies it. The crew believes it. The evidence suggests it, but we'll probably never have definitive proof. Here's what I want you to figure out, does it matter? I mean that seriously. Does it matter whether those armed men were officially Iranian Revolutionary Guard or just contractors working for Iran? Does it matter whether the crew knew the ship was breaking sanctions? Because at the end of the day, 28 men were held at gunpoint, forced to sail to a foreign country, and detained 4 weeks. Does the geopolitical context change whether that's a crime? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think. The crew who made it home to India in July 2020 tried to move on with their lives, but this isn't the kind of experience you just forget. Several crew members reported suffering from PTSD, anxiety, nightmares about the hijacking, and their careers essentially destroyed. Who wants to hire a sailor who has been involved in an international incident involving sanctions violations and alleged hijacking? Even though these men were victims, they became toxic in the maritime job market. One crew member gave an anonymous interview to a maritime magazine. He said, "I just wanted to work, earn money for my family, and come home. Instead, I got caught in something I didn't understand, held at gunpoint, kept prisoner in a foreign country, and now I can't find work. How is that fair?" It's not fair. But fairness has nothing to do with how maritime law, international politics, and sanctions enforcement actually work. And here's the thing that makes me absolutely furious. None of these men received any compensation. No settlement from the ship owners, no support from insurance companies, no reparations from any of the governments involved. They were hijacked, held hostage, traumatized for life, and they got nothing. How is that justice? How is that fair? Comment below if you think these crew members deserve compensation. And if you do, who should pay? The ship owner, Iran, the US government, for inadequate protection of vessels in the region. I want to know what you think's right here. But you know what? Some of these men refused to be broken. A few of them became advocates for maritime worker rights. They started speaking at conferences, giving interviews, pushing for better protections for seafarers caught in situations like theirs. One crew member, woe and name him for his safety, has become one of the loudest voices demanding reform in how international incidents involving merchant vessels are handled. He's testified before maritime safety committees. He's worked with human rights at sea. He has made it his mission to ensure that what happened to the Gulf Sky crew never happens again. That's courage. Real courage. Not the Hollywood version where you fight back against the bad guys with your fists, but the everyday courage of standing up and saying, "This was unright," when powerful governments would prefer you stay quiet. These 28 men survived something that most of us can't even imagine. And while some of them are still struggling, others have found ways to turn their trauma into purpose. That's the human spirit right there. That's resilience. But their story isn't over, because right now, as I'm recording this video, there are other crews trapped in similar situations around the world. Ships detained in foreign ports, workers caught between sanctions and politics, families wondering when their loved ones will come home. The Mount Gulf Sky wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. Unless we do something about it. Let me show you something that should terrify you. Right now today there are an estimated 400,000 seafarers working on international vessels, and at any given moment, thousands of them are stuck on ships that have been detained, abandoned, or caught in legal limbo. Some because their ship owners went bankrupt and just left them there. Some because of sanctions violations like the Gulf Sky. Some because of port state control issues, mechanical problems, or unpaid port fees. These are people, fathers, sons, brothers who went to work and ended up trapped, sometimes for years, with no clear path home. The International Maritime Organization tracks some of these cases, but many fall through the cracks. Many are never reported. Many are like the Gulf Sky, buried under diplomatic silence and corporate embarrassment. And you want to know the dirtiest secret of the global shipping industry? The one thing that all these incidents have in common: nobody with power actually cares. Ships carry 90% of global trade. Everything on your phone, your clothes, your food probably came on a ship at some point. The global economy literally depends on maritime workers. But when those workers get caught in impossible situations, when they become inconvenient, they're abandoned. Because they're mostly from developing countries: India, Philippines, Indonesia. Because they have no political power, because their suffering doesn't affect the bottom line of the companies that employ them or the governments that regulate them. So here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about this. When you buy something that was shipped from another country, do you ever think about the people who transported it? Do you ever wonder what conditions they work in? Whether they're being treated fairly, whether they're safe? Most people don't. I didn't either until I started researching maritime incidents like the Gulf Sky. But maybe we should. Because our demand for cheap goods, fast shipping, and convenient consumption is built on the backs of workers who have almost no protections and no voice. But it doesn't have to be this way. Things can change. Maritime worker protections can be strengthened. International treaties can be enforced. Companies can be held accountable. It just requires that people care, that people pay attention, that people demand better. So here is what I'm asking you to do right now. First, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I'm going to keep investigating maritime incidents that governments and corporations would rather you never hear about. Every view, every share, every comment helps these stories reach more people. Second, share this video with anyone who works in shipping, maritime industries, or international trade. They need to know these stories. They need to understand the risks their colleagues face. Third, in the description below, I've linked to 3 organizations fighting for maritime worker rights. Human Rights at Sea, the International Transport Workers Federation, the Mission to Seafarers. Even if you can donate, just visit their websites. Learn about what they do. Share their work. Fourth, if you're in a position of power, if you work for a shipping company, a government agency, an insurance company, use your influence. Push for better protections. Demand transparency. Hold people accountable. 28 men went through hell on the Mount Gulf Sky. They survived, but they shouldn't have had to. The armed men who boarded that ship in the middle of the night were criminals whether they wore official uniforms or not. The governments that played politics with human lives were complicit. The companies that left their workers vulnerable were negligent. And the world that shrugged and moved on were all part of that. But we don't have to be anymore. I am going to leave you with this. If you were one of those 28 crew members, if you had been held at gunpoint, forced to sail to a foreign country, detained for weeks, and then forgotten by the world, what would you want people to do? Would you want them to share your story? Would you want them to demand justice? Would you want them to fight for change so it doesn't happen to the next crew? I think you would. I know I would. So, let's do that. Let's make sure the Mount Gulf Sky incident isn't forgotten. Let's make sure those 28 men's suffering meant something. Let's make sure the next crew in a similar situation has people fighting for them. The ocean doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about sanctions. It doesn't care about corporate profits. But we should care about the people who work on it. I'm Twisted Krimunveld, and I'll see you in the depths next week. We re-diving into the MV Express, Pearl disaster container ship, carrying tons of chemicals that caught fire off Sri Lanka, creating one of the worst environmental disasters in maritime history. But here is what we're not telling you. The crew saw warning signs days before the fire started and were ordered to ignore them. The truth waits for no one.